Let's go Ravens! Something is happening with the Baltimore Ravens that could completely change how people view the team this season, and the most interesting thing is that some of the biggest surprises may not come from where everyone expects. There are projections causing a great stir right now, and while some numbers seem impressive, others are already generating major debates behind the scenes. Some people believe that certain players are being underestimated, others think expectations are too high, and there are some predictions that could completely shock Ravens fans by the end of the year. The question is, which ones are real and which ones are about to explode beyond expectations? But before we continue, be sure to like this post if you truly believe this team can surprise everyone this season, because all Ravens fans are closely following the unfolding of this story. And I want to hear from the most optimistic fans in this community right now. Go to the comments and write, 2026 is our year. Go, Ravens! Now let's get directly into what everybody is talking about, because projections for the roster have started generating serious reactions, and it all begins with QB1, Lamar Jackson. The projected numbers being discussed show a completion percentage of 64.8%, with 3,884 passing yards, 26 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, along with nearly 700 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns. And immediately, this creates one of the most fascinating discussions around this offense. The passing production feels strong, but the rushing numbers are where people begin asking questions. Last season there was discussion about a noticeable step backward in rushing production, and there are several possibilities that were brought up. Was it related to injuries? Was protection a factor? Was it simply natural changes over time? Nobody truly knows yet, but this season may finally provide some answers, because if the offensive environment improves, the entire picture could change. And speaking of the offensive environment, one reason there seems to be growing optimism is because of expectations surrounding improvements up front. There was strong discussion about better pass protection and also stronger run blocking. The belief is that the additions and coaching adjustments could significantly help both the passing game and the ground game. Then the conversation moves to the running game, and once again Derrick Henry is projected to produce massive numbers. The projection being discussed shows 317 carries, 1,480 rushing yards, and 23 touchdowns. Those are enormous expectations. What's interesting is that the discussion wasn't even centered around whether he can produce anymore. The conversation almost feels like people have moved beyond asking if he can still do it. Instead, the question has become, when does it stop? Because the expectation being discussed is that stronger run blocking could allow him to continue taking advantage of opportunities at a very high level. Then things become even more interesting once you enter the receiver room, because Zay Flowers is projected for 1,172 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns on 82 catches. Those numbers would represent a career high. But then attention shifts toward the rest of the receiver room and what the hierarchy could look like later in the season. There was heavy discussion around the possibility that things may not look the same by week 18 as they do at the beginning of the year. Right now, there appears to be confidence regarding the early pecking order, but once the season develops and younger players continue gaining opportunities, everything becomes harder to predict. And then we reach one of the strongest disagreements from these projections, the tight end room. Mark Andrews being projected above 600 receiving yards created immediate pushback. The discussion wasn't simply about totals, it was about how the room itself may evolve. There was emphasis on younger players potentially becoming more involved as receiving threats, creating the possibility of a different distribution of production. There was also discussion surrounding the idea that younger players could bring more dynamic playmaking opportunities into the offense. And what makes all of this fascinating is that we are only talking about one side of the football right now. Because once conversations started moving toward defense, there were discussions of major production from multiple units, including the defensive line and secondary. But that opens up an entirely different conversation that may completely reshape expectations surrounding this team. The conversation becomes even more intense when attention shifts to the other side of the football, because some of the projected numbers being discussed on defense are creating massive expectations across multiple position groups. And if these projections come anywhere close to reality, Ravens fans could be watching some very interesting developments unfold over the course of the season. Let's start with the interior defensive line, because there was serious excitement around this group. Nnamdi Madubuike was projected for nearly 50 tackles and 5.5 sacks across approximately 670 snaps, while Travis Jones was projected for 3.5 sacks and heavy involvement as well. But the biggest point here was not simply individual statistics. The focus was the possibility that this group together could become something special. There was extremely strong belief in what the middle of this defensive front could potentially become once all pieces are on the field together. In fact, The discussion went as far as suggesting this group could develop into one of the strongest interior defensive lines in football if everything comes together as expected. And that leads directly into another position group that suddenly starts generating major questions: the edge room. Trey Hendrickson was projected to lead the team with 10 sacks while also playing a huge number of snaps. Meanwhile, Mike Green was projected for 5 sacks, and there was immediate discussion suggesting that number could potentially be much higher. What's interesting here is that the feeling wasn't disappointment with the projection itself. Instead, there was almost an expectation that Mike Green could exceed it. The belief seemed centered around the idea that development and defensive structure could potentially allow him to produce more than projected. That's what makes these preseason discussions fascinating, because sometimes fans don't argue because a number is too high. Sometimes they argue because they think it is too low. Then attention moves toward the linebacker room, where Roquan Smith was projected for 142 tackles and over 1,000 snaps. That's an enormous workload. But there was another name receiving significant attention: Teddy Buchanan. The discussion surrounding Teddy Buchanan was extremely interesting because this wasn't simply about immediate production. This was about long-term belief in his ability as a football player. There was confidence expressed regarding his potential ceiling and his ability moving forward, with only minor concerns being raised. The overall tone surrounding him felt very optimistic. Then things move into the secondary, and suddenly you start hearing numbers that could make Ravens fans very excited. Nate Wiggins and Marlon Humphrey were projected to lead the cornerback room in snaps, while both being projected for 2 interceptions. There was also discussion suggesting these players could form the core rotation at the position if health remains on their side. And then we arrive at what was described as potentially one of the strongest position groups on the roster: the safety room. Kyle Hamilton was projected for more than 108 tackles, 3 interceptions, and over 1,000 snaps. Alongside him, Malachi Starks and Jalen Hawkins were discussed as a group that could become extremely fun to watch together. The excitement wasn't just about statistics. The excitement was about communication, chemistry, and how the unit could function collectively. And then finally came one number that might summarize everything surrounding these expectations: a projected win total of 11.5 games. But even there was pushback, because the feeling was that the team could potentially exceed that total. And that's what makes this entire conversation fascinating. Across the offense, defense, and even special teams, projections are setting expectations, but projections never step on the field. Numbers on paper can create excitement, debates, and arguments, but eventually reality takes over and answers every question. What also makes these projections interesting is how several of the discussions were not really about whether the numbers themselves are possible, but about where the biggest surprises could happen. Some of the strongest reactions came from projections that people felt were either too conservative or too optimistic, and that tells you there are still a lot of unanswered questions surrounding how this roster develops throughout the season. Take special teams as an example. Tyler Loop was projected at an 85% field goal percentage and 96% on extra points. The discussion around him was that despite a difficult moment late in the season, there was still a feeling that his rookie year overall was solid. And sometimes fans focus only on quarterbacks, running backs, or defensive stars, but seasons are